Hello, and a very warm welcome to all of you attending the DVS Society Autumn Conference webinar. I'm Charles Beauclerc. I'm honored and delighted to have been asked to introduce this venture, the first of its kind for our society. Our collective thanks, I won't name anyone, but our collective thanks are due to those who've devised the means of gathering us together in the ether and who are holding us suspended here in impeccable order, one hopes, for the next few hours. Thanks also to those who have put this marvelous program together. And lastly, our gratitude goes out to our speakers and performers tonight, including our mystery guest. The DVS Society, I'm glad to say, is in very good shape. The wind is in its sails. We have many new ventures afoot. There really is a sense of excitement and fresh purpose. There's also some marvelous research being done at the moment, groundbreaking research, in fact. And here, at the risk of being invidious, I would like to mention one individual, and that is our distinguished chairman, Alexander Waugh, who over the past years has produced a string of white rabbits from his top hat and astonished us all, and particularly in this field that we are discussing tonight of Edward de Vere and his literary contemporaries. So hats off to you, Alexander. Now, the focus of the De Vere Society is Edward de Vere himself, whose name means prosperous guardian of the truth. And it is under the aegis of truth that we make our way. Our chief work in the Society lies in bringing Edward de Vere before the public and introducing his story to our culture through every medium available to us. Not only is he our lodestar, but his story and his art, interwoven as they are, can be like a holy tree to inspire our ailing land. And it's important on this journey that we do not condemn those whose approach to the truth differs from our own. After all, we all share one overarching truth, de Vere's authorship. Ours is a high pinnacle pavilion. We are indeed a band of brothers and sisters, ready and willing to shed, if not our blood, our ink copiously in the cause. Now, before I vanish, which I hope I shall, I'd like to say just one thing about our protagonist. You remember that at the end of The Tempest, Prospero's final words, the last two lines of the play, are, "As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free." Now, this concept of indulgence was crucial to the Earl of Oxford, I feel. He didn't want us to make a shining icon of him. He wanted us to understand him wherever that understanding might lead. We can only set him free in this way. The dying Hamlet begs his friend Horatio to draw his breath in pain to tell his story. Why? Because his is a painful story to tell, one, you might say, requiring indulgence. And for this, my fellow Horatios, all our voices are essential. Gentle breath of yours, my sails must fill, or else my project fails. Our conference, friends, is now open.
I wanted to start, obviously, by thanking Charles for his brilliant, wise, beautiful and seductive words. I also wanted to tell everybody what I'm buying for everybody else for Christmas, and it's this book called Take Physic Pomp. It's been put together by Charles and his wife, and it's a little book that reveals Shakespeare as philosopher and all-round Apothecary of the Soul. It's exactly what we need at the moment. It's a very nice little anthology of Shakespeare with Charles and Sarah's commentary on it. So I very much recommend that. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce our first speaker this evening, and that is Kevin Gilvary. He is our honorary president. He is also famed in the world of Oxfordiana for being the editor of one of the great seminal texts of our thesis, and that is called Dating Shakespeare's Plays, a critical review of the evidence. It's the only book-length study of the date of Shakespeare's plays, and it is absolutely brilliant. Those who want to look at it can find it online, and very shortly it'll be back in print for people to buy readable copies. We're very excited to hear Kevin, who's about to talk on the subject of the theatre and the folly. By the folly, we can well assume that he means Fisher's Folly, the great house of the idiot builder Jasper Fisher, who went bust and sold it to the Earl of Oxford. So over to you, Kevin.
It is indeed a great honour for me to be president of the DVS Society during this exciting venture. The DVS has been making great strides recently, both in developing new social media as well as continuing our exciting and rigorous research. For their insights on the theatre and of folly and other topics, I would like to give a few special welcomes. A good afternoon to Jan Cole in Castle Hedingham, a midday hello to Cheryl Egan Donovan in Boston, Massachusetts, an early morning wake-up call to Earl Sharman in Oregon, and a midnight greeting to Jane Nelson in Adelaide, Australia. Welcome to you one and all. I would like to set the scene in April 1580, just a week before Oxford's 30th birthday, when the following frightening event happened. It came at eve as April day shut up its watery eye, and filled all London with dismay, and that all sudden lie. In open street did all men meet, leaving their houses, shaking fearfully. The bells as of themselves did toll, the knell of all the people. Huge stones fell down, and others roll from tower top and from steeple. This was the first account of a famous earthquake which shook London on the 6th of April, 1580, and it was provided in a broadsheet ballad that was published the very next day. Another person to give an account of the event was Thomas Churchyard, who was actually watching some entertainment in the theatre at the moment the quake struck. He wrote this: "A number being at the theatre in the curtain at Holywell, beholding the plays, were so shaken, especially those that stood in the highest rooms and standings, that they were not a little dismayed, considering that they would no way shift for themselves, unless they would, by leaping, hazard their lives or limbs, as some did indeed, leaping from the standings." Other writers published accounts of the 1580 quake, and interestingly, many of those writers were associated with Oxford. Thomas Churchyard himself was a soldier of fortune in the Falstaff mode, and had been employed by Oxford to report on events in the Netherlands. Another writer was Arthur Golding, Oxford's uncle and translator of its Metamorphoses. Then we have an account by the writer Thomas Twine, who dedicated his translation of the Breviary of Britain to Earl of Oxford. Anthony Munday was yet another member of the Oxford Circle. He gave a short account of the earthquake, adding a list of grisly murders and other signs of God's displeasure. And then there was Abraham Fleming, who collected various reports and published them together 2 months later. The publisher, not a fly-by-night, was Henry Denham, highly respected, who was responsible for both editions of Holinshead. So, Oxford's connections with at least 5 scholarly writers whose accounts of the earthquake were published together is truly remarkable. It constitutes clear evidence that Oxford was at the centre of a very important literary coterie. And we'll be hearing more about some of those writers later today. But first, let us recall Oxford's theatrical interests in the late 1570s and early 1580s. About half a mile north of the city of London lay Holywell Priory, or to give it its full name, the Augustinian Priory of St. John the Baptist at Holywell. The church itself had a spire, and the priory enclosed about 3 acres of land. One of the last ecclesiastical events to occur there was the first marriage of John, 16th Earl of Oxford, and his first wife, Dorothy Neville. That happened on the 3rd of July, 1536. Soon afterwards, the foundation was dissolved and the property split up. After passing through various owners, Leicester's men acquired the lease on land and buildings in the northwest corner. There, they constructed a wooden theatre. Within a year, another party acquired the southeast corner of the precinct at Holywell and constructed another theatre, the Curtain, taking its name from the outer wall of the original priory. I argue that the development of the Curtain Theatre was guided by Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. Now on this slide, we can see the location of these purpose-built theatres. They're highlighted in blue at the top of the map, just north of where Liverpool Street Station lies today. Now to the west of the city was Savoy Hospital, which had been founded by Henry VII for the poor, needy and infirm. By the 1570s, the main rooms were let to various noblemen, and Oxford came to occupy the master's room in the late 1570s. At the bottom right, in brown, we see the Tower of London. Now you will recall that Oxford spent a few weeks at Her Majesty's pleasure in 1581 there. In the centre, highlighted in green, is the old St Paul's Cathedral, centre of the book trade. Leading down from St Paul's to the river lies Peter's Lane, where Oxford lived from about 1590. Alexander will be telling us more about this site. Returning to Holywell in blue, this was a very clever choice of location for Leicester to locate his playing company. It lay just outside the jurisdiction of the City of London, and also the Priory still retained its status as a liberty beyond the powers of the Middlesex magistrates. Regarding the establishment of the theatre and the curtain, the standard view has been that acting companies were now able to play regularly to the paying public. However, I think this was a secondary effect of the establishment of the theatre. The main purpose that Leicester ran a company of players was to mount prestigious performances before the Queen and Court, not just for his own glory, but also to influence the Queen. Just the previous year, in 1575, Leicester had presented lavish entertainments at Kenilworth. Now, with their dedicated base at the theatre, Leicester's men could park their pageant wagons, the Elizabethan equivalent of a juggernaut. They could stable their horses. They could plan and rehearse their entertainments away from prying eyes. They could store the most valuable items in their possessions. Those were the costumes. They could store their play scripts. Apart from the master's script, each character's part was written on a roll of paper. At the end of the performance, the company manager would retrieve these rolls so as to keep them together, presumably putting them in some kind of sack or a trunk. As the company's repertoire of plays expanded, so they needed more sacks or more trunks, which in turn needed more storage space. Finally, they could play for money, a useful little earner for Leicester's men, but subordinate to their main function of performing at court. These opportunities applied equally well to the development of the curtain. The curtain never had the prestige of the theatre. Presumably it was established for the same reasons. And I suggest that in 1577, Oxford was emulating Leicester, that two lords were maintaining covert bases for their acting companies. In fact, Oxford was establishing a base for an adult company before he even acquired the actual players. He was also establishing a base to use as a fencing school. Right, if we move on to slide 7, we see that the area is currently under development for a huge complex to be known appropriately as the stage. So this is what it should be looking like in a couple of years' time. It's progressing well, and the latest plan includes a visitor centre showcasing the remains of the Curtain Playhouse, so that we will soon be standing on a glass platform directly above the stage on which Oxford produced the plays. We must also bear in mind that by far the most important reason for a nobleman such as Leicester or Oxford to run a company of players was to perform at court, to raise their own standing, to demean others, influence policy. In this picture, we see a figure looking very like John Dee as Prospero, charming the Queen and the court. During the 1570s, Oxford was renowned for composing a series of successful plays. Just a few days before the earthquake shook London, he took over Warwick's men from Ambrose Dudley. His troupe, now known as Oxford men, included John and Lawrence Dutton and Jerome Savage, very important actors. Soon afterwards, they were joined by Anthony Munday, probably as an actor or maybe as an actor manager. During a temporary sojourn in the Tower of London, Oxford continued to produce plays, and by 1582, Leicester's men and Oxford's men were the two most prominent companies at court. Their rivalry was, however, curtailed in 1583. With the Lord Chamberlain, Thomas Radcliffe, Earl of Sussex and ailing health, Francis Walsingham set up the Queen's Men by taking the best actors from various companies, especially Leicester's and Oxford's. Instead of being rivals and trying to gain their own prestige and influence at court, they were now working for the prestige and influence of the Privy Council. The Queen's Men was a new super company, but they still needed to rehearse and prepare. where better than before a public audience at a venue such as the theatre or the curtain? Indeed, in December 1583, the Privy Council instructed the Lord Mayor of London to allow such rehearsals. Their order reads, "The Council, considering that without frequent exercise of such plays as were to be presented before Her Majesty, her servants, the Queen's men, could not conveniently satisfy her recreation and their own duty, desired that they should be licensed to perform upon weekdays and work days." So, Privy Council realising the importance of rehearsal and practice before they performed at court. We believe that for the Queen's men from 1583 onwards, Oxford was employed to write patriotic historical plays for them. They performed at court and also at theatre at Shoreditch and on tour in England. The curtain, which was sort of the lesser of the two, seemed to be available for hire. Other playing companies went there and fencing matches used it. Now, let's just remind ourselves of some of the locations with regards to Fisher's Folly. To the north of the city in blue were the theatre and the curtain. The location of Oxford's lodgings is Savoy Hospital over on the west, and they were not convenient for the curtain. So in 1580, within a week or so of the earthquake, Oxford acquired a large property nearby, Fisher's Folly. The owner, one Jasper Fisher, had died in 1579, and Oxford acquired the lease. 2 years later, he bought it outright. The Folly was located just outside the city walls, next to present-day Liverpool Street Station, and most importantly, near the theatres. Fisher's Folly is highlighted in yellow beyond the city walls. It lay to the east or the right of the Great North Road, just outside Bishopsgate. John Stowe describes the mansion in lavish terms, calling it a large and beautiful house with gardens of pleasure, bowling alleys, and sumptuously builded. The property included 20 cottages, 30 gardens, and 10 orchards. I presume by 30 gardens, they mean kitchen gardens. Oxford owned Fisher's Folly for most of the 1580s, and here he seems to have organised a writing circle. Now, the most important thing that writers need is a pub. And in fact, there are two pubs nearby, the Dolphin and the Pie Inn. We can see the Pie Inn, the Dolphin's just a bit above. The nearest church was directly opposite, St. Bottles without Bishopsgate. This was the parish church of Elizabeth Bassano Lanier, where she was baptised and where she was married. And it's possible, and perhaps quite likely, that she was part of the coterie. Another lady with educated taste and a reputation for wit was Anne Vavasor. So perhaps when she had fallen from the Queen's favour, she too might have attended the school. And we recall that she gave birth to Oxford's son the following March. So therefore, at the same time as he's developing Fisher's Folly, he is conducting an affair with Vavasor. Thanks to Colin Jolly for this and to Jan Cole. It was published in the DVS Society newsletter a while ago. Fisher's Folly is highlighted in yellow, and adjoining it in browny orange is a tract of land known as the Great Garden of Christchurch. This tract was close to the theatre inns outside Aldgate and the Whitechapel Road, which leads eastwards to Chelmsford and directly onto Castle Hedingham. Oxford was now able to dedicate his interest as patron of his own writing company with a chance for his companies to perform at the Boar's Head, probably named after the family, but maybe going back a few generations, and the George Inn, and there are smaller venues further along, Red Lion, which has just been excavated. Oxford retained these two ones, the yellow one and the brown one, for most of the 1580s, a period crucial for the development drama leading to Shakespeare's plays. Right, let's move on to the members of Oxford's writing circle. I think the two most important ones, Alexander would probably disagree. I think two of the most important were John Lilly. He was the author of the highly acclaimed Euphues text, which had a great influence on the style of Shakespeare. During the 1580s, Lilly composed plays which were performed by Oxford's Children's Company at court. He seems to be associated with Oxford from the 1570s, as he was living in Savoy when Oxford was still there. Harvey calls Lilly the full master of the theatre and Oxford's minion secretary. Second person who I think was most important was Anthony Munday. He had travelled on the continent and translated plays and romances. In the dedication of Primalion of Greece in 1619, Munday de Vere, 18th Earl, that Munday had served that most noble Earl your father, famous and desertful memory, and translated diverse honourable histories into English out of French, Italian and other languages, which he, Edward de Vere, graciously pleased to countenance with his noble acceptance. While the 17th Earl was alive, Monday dedicated various works to him, including Mirror of Mutability, Zelauto and Palmerin. Now, we just had Thomas Churchyard describing the earthquake. He was a wide-ranging author known for his tavern wit. He was fat, he was jolly, and he almost certainly appeared in plays, first as Falstaff in The Merry Wives, and then as Oldcastle in the Henry IV plays. During the 1580s, Churchyard published a wide variety of texts, including, which I only found out recently, a translation of Ovid's Laments from Exile, which we were talking about the other day as being quite important. Right, a fourth one was Thomas Nash, a noted satirist who confirmed that Oxford obtained high fame by his pen, being the first in our language I have encountered that repurified poetry from art's pedantism, and that instructed it to speak courtly. Nash wrote of the selected good scholars, 17 poets and playwrights who had been patronised by Oxford. 17 poets and playwrights. Now this is a turn up for the books which Alexander's put on to me, and something which I greatly underestimated before. In the next few talks, we're going to hear about 4 more members of Oxford's literary circle. Alexander Fleming, one of the main contributors to the Chronicles of Holinshead. Holinshead died in 1582, and Fleming was the one who brought out the second edition. Eddie Jolly will be telling us about his writing activities. Then there's Thomas Watson, an overlooked poet and translator who adapted poems from French, Italian and Latin models and put them into elegant English. We'll be hearing from Ian Johnson about him. And Thomas Kidd, a promising playwright. Alexander will inform us more about Kidd's patronage that he got from an unnamed lord. And then, of course, there's Christopher Marlowe, who has an intriguing connection to Oxford. Now, if you are going to buy one more book on literary renaissance of the Elizabethan period, please make sure it's the recently published Renaissance Man, The World of Thomas Watson by DVS member Ian Johnson, who will be addressing us soon. So, in the late 1570s and throughout the 1580s, Oxford was not only a busy playwright composing plays for his own company to perform at court, but he was also supporting and encouraging a host of new literary talent. I now hand over to the lovely Rosemary O'Loughlin in the Emerald Isle, who's been on the lookout for any questions that people might have. Rosemary.
Thank you, Kevin, and greetings here from Dublin, Ireland. We will now have 10 minutes for some Q&A before we hand back to Alexander. So if I can just encourage everyone to make sure to type the questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat box. So we already have some questions coming in. Kevin, I'm going to ask you one from Richard Wagaman. He says, is it possible that Monday collaborated with Oxford on the first full English translation of the Decameron? And he thinks that Decameron shows many connections with Shakespeare's works as well as to Monday's works, and Monday was called a one-man translation factory.
I definitely think so. I think that the Decameron's influence on Shakespeare is greatly underestimated. And although there are only 2 or 3 stories which are directly linked, I think that a lot of the themes in the courtly manners seem to derive from the Decameron. So I would definitely think that Oxford's involved in it. Possibly Monday did more of the donkey work and Oxford helped him with more difficult work. But they both travelled in Italy. So I imagine that they were both pretty good at translating Italian. So I would say, Richard, nice to talk to you. Yes, definitely. I would say that Oxford collaborated with Monday on translation of Boccaccio's Decameron.
Thank you, Kevin. I have a question here from Martin Carden, and he asks about Walsingham, who is often portrayed as dour and obviously as a spy master, but seems in fact to have many theatrical and literary influences. What do you think?
Hello, yeah, very interesting question. My impression is hard. I mean, you're asking my opinion on this. My impression is that Walsingham didn't actually like it very much. And I think it's a bit the same with James I, but they thought it was very important because it had such an influence. And James I was happy for these more serious plays to be presented at court because it impressed the ambassadors, impressed some of the nobles. I think Walsingham saw the propaganda value of having the Queen's men under his control and first of all, instilling a sense of patriotism at court amongst the nobles who might be a bit dissident and might be a bit inclined towards Catholicism or inclined towards Spain, but also to send them off, perhaps in different groups at the same time, in different directions around the country, to say, look, this is us, here we are, beating the drum. So I'm not sure that Walsingham personally was interested in theatre, but I think he certainly saw the value of it.
Thank you, Kevin. I have a question here from Ron Rothel. Could it be that the Lord Chamberlain's men was patronised in secret by De Vere and not the successive Lords Chamberlain as is assumed?
Well, I think there's slightly different roles involved. I think the Lord Chamberlain's men are licensing, or the Lord Chamberlain is licensing the players, and he's encouraging them to appear before court. But what's actually being done with them and the type of plays that's going on, I think Oxford's much more involved in it. There's a big question really what Oxford was doing in the 1590s. We know that he was injured and he didn't travel very far. So I suspect that he was spending more time in the 1590s revising some of the plays. So we go from Hamlet, the short quarto, to the longer one, and other plays like that, as well as writing some fairly sort of despairing tragedies like Timon of Athens in Coriolanus, which don't get a mention anywhere and perhaps might not have been performed. So I think he's certainly involved with them, but I don't know how much of a hands-on role he had compared to what he was doing in the 1580s.
Thank you. Now I'm going to go back to another question from Martin Carden. It's a very interesting question. I've wondered it myself. He's fascinated by the term, I can never even pronounce it, silextra, to do with obviously Fisher's Folly. And he wonders, does it have a meaning?
You've got me on that one. I'm afraid I really don't know.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, Kevin. I have a question here from Amanda Hines. Was De Vere genuinely frightened, as Mundy said he was? I presume that must be to do with the earthquake.
Well, most of the earthquake pamphlets said that this was God sort of threatening the country, and the wrath was coming along. And Anthony Munday talked about grisly murders, linking them up and seeing it all as sort of terrible signs of an impending apocalypse. I'm not sure that Oxford or any of the others were necessarily persuaded about that, but I think that from a point of view of trying to sort of shake up the populace and say, watch out, there is an impending apocalypse, and it's called Spain, and they're constructing their Armada Invencible, their invincible armada, as they still call it. So I'm not sure. I think Alexander's got a stronger viewpoint on that, is that Oxford is writing from a government point of view. Personally, I don't think that he was too affected by the earthquake, but it was certainly sort of quite a big event. And if you're actually in the theatre, and if he was on stage performing Henry V or something, then this would, well, almost brought the house down.
Indeed. Speaking of the earthquake, Kevin, what comes through in Shakespeare's work on the subject of the earthquake?
Well, I was hoping that you were going to ask that one. So if you can go to slide 17, and if we've got Annabelle standing by, we can hear a passage from Shakespeare, and we will see how it appears.
'Tis since the earthquake now 11 years, and she was weaned, I never shall forget it, of all the days of the year upon that day. For I had then laid wormwood to my dug, sitting in the sun under the dove-house wall, my lord and you were then at Mantua. Nay, I do bear a brain. But, as I said, when it did taste the wormwood on the nipple of my dug, and felt it bitter, pretty fool, to see it tetchy and fall out with the dug. Shake, quoth the dove-house, 'twas no need, I trow, to bid me trudge. And since that time it is 11 years.
Now, the nurse repeats the phrase, 11 years, and she says it twice. There's no need really for her to say it at all, but she does make a real point of it. And I think such a gratuitous allusion strongly indicates the date of 1591 for at least that passage in Romeo and Juliet, 11 years since an earthquake nearly brought the house down in London.
Thank you, Kevin. I have a question here from Cheryl Egan Donovan. Is there any extant correspondence between the Fisher Folly writers and De Vere?
I think I'm going to have to bow to Alexander, and he will be mentioning that a bit later on.
Okay, thank you. Let me see. I have a question here myself for you, Kevin. What support do you think that Oxford provided in the Fisher's Folly accommodation for the writers?
Right, well, if we can have a look at slide 16, I was wondering about whether to include it. This is my view of what would be needed. Firstly, accommodation, board and lodging, somewhere for them all to eat and sleep. Protection from other people, both out on the streets and from the authorities. Writing materials. I think people underestimate how much writing material that anyone who wrote the works of Shakespeare would get through at the time, and that wasn't cheap. Certainly, there's a library involved, and I think people will be encouraged to find out where the books could be bought, and they would be brought in there. Help with research, help with translation, and a kind of a reader's workshop where they would read to each other and say, "What do you think about this then, Squire?" And say, "Oh, I'm not sure. Oh, I quite like that one. Oh, I don't like that." Well, you never do. So I think that these writers have got their own individual styles, their own voice, and I think they're helping each other rather than, like Titian's workshop in Venice, where they're all churning out copies of the master. I think they're all doing it for themselves. So I think quite a variety of things going on, and it was probably a sort of a loose connection where people came and went. Some were certainly employed by Oxford, and others were, I think, others were sort of just on the edge or on the periphery. And possibly we had the women coming along as well, because I think if you've read Boccaccio, if you read the Decameron, or if you read the Courtier, you'll see that women, noble women, are very, very important, and they are the ones who keep up with everything.
Indeed. Kevin, thank you very much for that. We've now come to the end of our Q&A session, and I'm going to hand back to our host, Alexander Waugh.
I wanted to start by saying this is a very auspicious day, because it is, of course, the 12th of the 12th of 2020. And if you have the sort of crazy, devious mind of someone like John Dee, then you know 12/12/2020 signifies Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, double V. So we should be blessed. I think we could be a little bit negative and a little bit sad about the fact that we're having to run our meetings online on Zoom. We, of course, all of us who are used to the De Vere Society meetings are missing the conviviality of our eye-to-eye contact, and also particularly the carousing that goes on very often after those meetings. And we can't do that, but there are benefits to being on Zoom. And the most obvious benefit of all is that we have the largest meeting that the De Vere Society has ever had today. And we're joined here in England, not only by members around the world, by members of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, members of the De Vere Society, and quite a large group of people who are members of neither and have very generously given us a small donation in order to join in today. And of course, we're very international now, because we've not only got people who are in from Scotland and Wales and Ireland, we have people from France. We also have, and we're very excited to have, 2 Shakespeare song settings that have been composed especially for us today by their composers, who are going to sing them to us as world premieres on this very show. First acting session, which is 2 scenes from Much Ado About Nothing, performed by Richard and Annabel. So thank them very much for doing it. You can't clap. Waves of love somehow on the ether or through the chat. Over to you, Richard and Annabel.
I wonder that you will still be talking, Signor Benedict. Nobody marks you.
What, my dear Lady Disdain? Are you yet living?
Is it possible Disdain should die when she hath such meat food to feed it as Signor Benedict? Courtesy itself must convert to disdain if you come in her presence.
Then is courtesy a turncoat. But it is certain that I am loved of all ladies, only you excepted. And I would I could find in my heart that I had not a hard heart, for truly I love none.
A dear happiness to women, they would else have been troubled with a pernicious Suitor, I thank God and my cold blood I'm of your humour for that. I had rather hear my dog bark at a crow than a man swear he loves me.
God keep your ladyship still in that mind, so some gentleman or other shall scape a predestinate scratched face.
Scratching could not make it worse than 'twas such a face as yours.
Well, you are a rare parrot teacher.
A bird of my tongue is better than a beast of yours.
I would my horse had the speed of your tongue, and so good a continuer. But keep your way, in God's name, I have done.
You always end with a jade's trick. I know you of old. And the next scene is when Benedict has heard that Beatrice is in love with him.
This can be no trick. The conference was sadly born. They have the truth of this from Hera. They seem to pity the lady. It seems her affections have their full bent. Love me. Why? It must be requited. I hear how I am censured. They say I will bear myself proudly if I perceive the love come from her. They say too that she will rather die than give any sign of affection. I never did think to marry. I must not seem proud. Happy are they that hear their detractions and can put them to mending. They say the lady is fair. 'Tis a truth, I can bear them witness, and virtuous. 'Tis so I cannot reprove it. And wise, but for loving me. By my troth, it is no addition to her wit, nor no great argument of her folly, for I will be horribly in love with her. I may chance to have some odd quirks and remnants of wit broken on me, because I have railed so long against marriage. But doth not the appetite alter? A man loves the meat in his youth that he cannot endure in his age. Shall quips and sentences and these paper bullets of the brain awe a man from the career of his humour? No, the world must be peopled. When I said I would die a bachelor, I did not think I should live till I were married. Here comes Beatrice. By this day she is a fair lady. I do spy some marks of love in her.
Against my will, I am sent to bid you come in to dinner.
Oh, fair Beatrice, I thank you for your pains.
I took no more pains for those thanks than you take pains to thank me. If it had been painful, I would not have come.
You take pleasure then in the message?
Yea, just so much as you may take upon a knife's point and choke a door withal. You have no stomach, signor? Fare you well.
Ha! Against my will, I am sent to bid you come in to dinner. There's a double meaning in that. I took no more pains for those thanks than you took to thank me. That is as much as to say, any pains that I take for you is as easy as thanks. If I do not take pity on her, I am a villain. If I do not love her, I am a fool. I will go get her picture.
Thank you, and wonderful to hear these brilliant voices making so much life out of those words. We are now going to have the second presentation, which is from Eddie Jolly, who'll be familiar to many of you. I should say that the DVS Society does offer research grants, so if anyone has the time or energy to go to places like the Cave Family Archives or anywhere else, do apply to us, particularly if you're feeling quite poor and think you might need help with your travel or your expenses in some ways. I am going to mention Alvieri, but I didn't intend to spend very much time on it. It was going to be a passing remark. So I just might follow up that, of course, the word Alvieri means a beehive. It's a beehive in both Italian and in Latin. And that Thomas Nash, for instance, calls patrons drones. And we know also that Thomas Nash and others talk about this thing called bugonia, which is the birth of bees out of the carcass of an ox. So there are a lot of very tantalizing connections between the possibility of Oxford running this great gang of writers, this scriptorium, and it possibly being known as a hive, an alveary, drawn from Brugonia. But anyway, it's not now my turn to be talking about those sorts of matters, but to be reintroducing the brilliant and fantastical Annabel Leventon and Richard Clifford, who are going to give us the third little scene from that great play. And over to you. We are very happy to have you.
Lady Beatrice, have you wept all this while?
Yea, and I will weep a while longer.
I would not desire that.
You have no reason. I do it freely.
Surely I do believe your fair cousin is wrong.
Oh, how much might the man deserve of me that would right her?
Is there any way to show such friendship?
A very even way, but no such friend.
May a man do it?
It is a man's office, but not yours.
I do love nothing in the world so well as you. It's not that strange.
As strange as the thing I know not, it were as possible for me to say, I love nothing so well as you, but believe me not, and yet I lie not, I confess nothing, nor I deny nothing. I'm sorry for my cousin.
By my sword, Beatrice, thou lovest me.
Oh, do not swear and eat it.
I will swear by it that you love me, and I will make him eat it that says, I love not you.
Will you not eat your word?
With no sauce that can be devised to it. I protest, I love thee.
Why then? God forgive me.
What offence, sweet Beatrice?
You have stayed me in a happy hour. I was about to protest. I loved you.
And do it with all thy heart.
I love you with so much of my heart that none is left to protest.
Come, bid me do anything for thee.
Kill Claudio.
Not with a white word.
You kill me to deny it. Farewell.
Tarry, sweet Beatrice.
No, I am gone, though I am here. There is no love in you. Nay, I pray you, let me go.
Beatrice.
In faith, I will go.
We will be friends first.
You dare easier be friends with me than fight with mine enemy.
Is Claudio thine enemy?
Is he not approved in the height a villain that hath slandered, scorned, dishonoured my kinswoman? Oh, that I were a man! What? Bear her in hand until they come to take hands, and then with public accusation, uncovered slander, unmitigated rancour. Oh, God, that I were a man, I would eat his heart in the marketplace.
Hear me, Beatrice.
Talk with a man out at a window, a proper saying.
Nay, but Beatrice.
Sweet hero, she is wronged. She is slandered. She is undone.
Beatrice.
Princes and counties, surely a princely testimony, a goodly count, confect, a sweet gallant, surely. Oh, that I were a man for his sake, or that I had any friend would be a man for my sake. But manhood is melted into courtesies, valour into compliment, and men are only turned into tongue, and trim ones too. He is now as valiant as Hercules that only tells a lie and swears it. I cannot be a man with wishing. Therefore I will die a woman with grieving.
Tarry, good Beatrice. By this hand, I love thee.
Use it for my love some other way than swearing by it.
Think you in your soul that Count Claudio hath wronged Hero?
Yea, as sure as I have a thought or a soul.
Enough. I am engaged. I will challenge him. I will kiss your hand, and so I leave you. By this hand, Claudio shall render me a dear account. As you hear of me, so think of me. Go comfort your cousin. I must say she is dead. And so, Farewell.
Well, absolutely beautiful and thoroughly moving. Thank you very much indeed, both of you. Absolutely terrific, thank you. And lots of excitement about that going on in the chat. Now I'm going to introduce our third speaker, who doesn't know this, but he actually was the great inspiration behind this Band of Brothers conference, because we were all sitting around at a committee meeting at the DVS Society saying to one another, isn't it absolutely brilliant, Ian Johnson's book, Renaissance Man, The World of Thomas Watson. And it was out of that that the idea of this Band of Brothers conference happened. So I'm very grateful to him for that. The book is actually going to be one of the prizes that are going to be drawn out of the hat later on. And it's going to be a signed copy, not this one that's been thoroughly eaten up by my avaricious eyes. Ian, for those of you who don't know him, he's written many reviews and many articles. He's worked for a long time for the BBC. He trained as a historian. And as I say, he writes a brilliant sentence and is a very fine man. Over to you. Thank you, Ian Johnson.
Well, thank you, Alexander, for that almost embarrassingly kind introduction. I'd like to start with a little teaser. In 1635, Thomas Heywood published his Hierarchy of the Blessed Angels. Now, it's a very large book, 2 inches deep, 622 pages. About a third of the way through, Heywood lists 10 Latin poet playwrights who were noted imitators or adapters of other people's works. They are Latin ones. He then compares them with 15 Elizabethan and Jacobean poet playwrights, listing each with a short and familiar first name. So, for example, Robert Greene is Rob Greene, Christopher Marlowe, Kit Marlowe, that is Tom Kidd, Jack Fletcher, Ben Jonson, etc. Heywood seems to be saying that not one of these poets of his recent generation could achieve his name in full because he was a collaborator with or a front man for a nobleman. And I suppose I hardly need add that all 10 had likely connections with the Earl of Oxford circle. This is how Heywood wrote about Thomas Watson. Tom Watson, though he wrote able to make Apollo's self to dote upon his muse, for all that he could strive, yet never could to his full name arrive. Tom Watson, though he wrote able to make Apollo's self to dote upon his muse, for all that he could strive, yet never could to his full name arrive. So Tom Watson could never achieve his full name of Thomas because, try as he might, for all that he could strive, he still owed a debt to another writer. But Heywood is also praising Watson, saying that despite his indebtedness, Watson was by no means an empty wordsmith. Watson's muse, says Heywood, was so fine, so compelling that even Apollo doted upon it. And, you know, we're talking about Apollo here, the sun god of music, poetry, art, medicine, light, and knowledge. It's quite a compliment. And I should add a tentative comment here that some argue that the name Apollo at this time sometimes personifies the Earl of Oxford. So all that's just an introduction. It's an enigma, and I'd like to put it to one side. Thomas Watson was born in 1555, in May, actually, around about May, in the parish of St. Olave in London. His father was a member of the powerful company of drapers, extremely rich, and owner of at least 2 London houses. Thomas, however, could hardly have known his mother and father, for they died when he was 4, at which time, with his elder brother William, he was shipped off to Oxfordshire to his uncle Thomas Lee, his mother's brother. Lee was also a draper with connections to the Cecil family. He was wealthy and well-read, and the ideal guardian and mentor for his nephew. The Lee family had Catholic sympathies. In 1567, Thomas Watson was sent to board at Winchester College. Now, Catholicism pervaded that college. It was the last of the old established schools to buckle to the religious changes. Now, like the majority of Winchester's pupils, Watson went on to New College, Oxford, but he didn't take a degree there, and he took ship instead for the continent of Europe. It was the early 1570s. He was 15, and his decision may have been decided in the light that the commissioners for religion were hard at work, sweeping out of Oxford everyone that, to quote Anthony Wood, smelt of popery or were popish affected, suspending, imprisoning, or expelling them. It's likely that Watson headed for the University of Padua. Edward de Vere's first tutor, Sir Thomas Smith, had trained there, and at Padua, Watson may have encountered de Vere himself, for Oxford was journeying in Europe between 1575 and 1576, stopping at Padua once and Venice, which was just 25 miles away, twice. In 1576, Watson left Italy for the English College of Douai in Flanders, and that's remembered as a seminary for the training of English priests. By that year, he was a holder of a bachelor's degree, probably from Padua, perhaps from Douai. But now, the stench of death drifted across the Low Countries, when on the 6th of August 1576, a local rioter at the gates of Douai cried, "Were not all the Englishmen's throats cut last night?" Watson, with a few others, left for England the very next day. Now, this is very important. It's important to stress that Watson straddled two literary camps, supposedly fiercely opposed. Oxford's group, who met, as we know, mainly at Jasper's Folly, the Earl's Gate on Bishopsgate, where Euphuism held the sway, and the Walsingham, Sidney, and Wilton House coterie. The enmity between the two circles has been mentioned, but it may be exaggerated. Both were influenced by the Frenchman Ronsard, and quite possibly Euphuism lost its drive actually in the mid-1580s when the thrill of literary rivalries was sapped by the death of Sidney. Watson believed he owed a debt to Walsingham, which he declared in his glowing elegy Mediburus on Walsingham's death in 1590. I speculate that his loyalty dates back to the 1570s. Walsingham himself had been a well-regarded student at Padua, so perhaps he lubricated Watson's entry to the university. I also think it possible that in 1572, when Watson's uncle Thomas Lee died, and Watson's funds largely dried up for the time being, he may have looked for support from Walsingham, then in Paris as ambassador, to dangle as one small thread on Walsingham's intelligence web. Years later, in 1581, Walsingham returned to Paris with Watson among his entourage, employed to carry messages back to London. Into this context must be placed Watson's close friendship with Sir Thomas Walsingham's first cousin, Thomas Walsingham, and touching on that, his friendship with Christopher Marlowe. All three, Walsingham, Thomas Walsingham, Christopher Marlowe, and Thomas Watson, were close friends. When Watson returned from the continent to London in 1579, it's likely he set about making alliances with literary colleagues, probably at the Inns of Court. He lodged first in Westminster, where he shared a house with Edward and Anne Burnell, and he seems to have encouraged the delusions of Anne Burnell. Now, Anne Burnell was a butcher's daughter from East Cheap who had worked herself into a pitch of excitement when a witch assured her that marks on her body proved she was a child of Philip II of Spain. A dangerous delusion because it could suggest she was a daughter of Queen Mary and a claimant to the throne. Burnell alleged that her belief was encouraged by a gentleman that was said to be very well learned. That gentleman was Thomas Watson. When a few years later the case finally became before the Privy Council, Watson denied anything incriminating. Burnell herself refused to give up her claim, and in 1592, after Watson's death, was tied to a cart and whipped through the streets of London. Now, Burnell's husband, Edward, was a Catholic subversive from a not insignificant family. His sister was a favourite of the royal bedchamber, married to the grandson of Anthony Babington, and Edward himself was probably a Mr. Burnell imprisoned after the Babington plot in 1586. So you might think that Watson was acting as agent provocateur for Mr. Secretary Walsingham. Now, at this time, London's population was increasing rapidly, but relatively it was still small, and family interrelationships were common. And intriguingly, the Burnell affair sheds light on a couple of the band of brothers. Look again at Edward Burnell's family, and we discovered he was also the stepbrother of the poet and translator Barnaby Googe. Googe was a royal ward under the protection of Sir William Cecil, and must have been acquainted with Cecil's son-in-law, the Earl of Oxford, another former ward, and of course with Thomas Watson too. And here's another case. 5 days after poor deluded Anne Burnell was whipped through the streets of London in December 1592, a ballad about the affair sold hot off the press in those same streets. Its publisher was Edward White, whose catalogue includes works attributed to Oxford and William Shakespeare. White was well placed to glean inside information from Watson himself about the Burnell affair, because White was married to Sarah Lodge. Sarah was the half-sister of the writer Thomas Lodge, another member of the band of brothers. And Lodge's mother, Lady Anne, had brought up Watson's sister Magdalen on the death of her parents. In other words, in short, Thomas Watson's sister was also Thomas Lodge's little half-sister. Watson's first shining moment arrived with the publication of his The Hecatopathia, or Passionate Century of Love. The work was dedicated to Oxford, the year was 1582, and by now Watson had definitely thrown in his lot with the Earl. The Hecatopathia is a hodgepodge of love poems, which Watson called sonnets. All were 18 lines, and if you date by some 9 years, all subsequent true 14-line sonnets, including those by Philip Sidney. Now this work, the Hecatopathia, is suffused with De Vere's influence. Let's start with the title page, which is decorated with 4 woodcuts. Into the design of one of these blocks, I incorporated 2 Cayley greyhounds. Now, the Cayley greyhound, to quote J.P. Brooke Little, a former Clouseau King of Arms, is a rare monster. It has the head of a wildcat, frond-like horns, tufted body and tail, rather like a lion's, and 4 limbs, which end in claws. It was the badge of the Vere family. The Cayley greyhound was taken up in the arms of the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th Earls of Oxford. The 17th Earl ceased using the arms. Now, the woodcut in the Hecatopathia is as identical as makes no difference to one repeated 4 times in the first folio of William Shakespeare, published 41 years later in 1623. The first folio was sponsored by the brother Earls Pembroke and Montgomery, and the wife of the Earl of Montgomery was Susan de Vere, the daughter of the 17th Earl of Oxford. Turn the book's page and we discover Watson's dedication to the Earl of Oxford, in which he narrates the story of Apelles, the Greek painter regarded as the greatest of antiquity's artists. One of Apelles' most outstanding paintings depicted Alexander the Great holding a thunderbolt. Watson compares Oxford with Alexander the Great. Now that image reminds one of Gabriel Harvey's comparison of Oxford to Pallas Athena, the goddess of truth. Thine eyes flash fire, thy countenance shakes a spear. and as you will know probably, a hereditary title of De Vere before he succeeded as Earl of Oxford was Lord Bolbec, and the Bolbec crest shows a lion brandishing a broken spear. The Hecatombathia also contains a series of puffs sung by friends and protégés of the Earl of Oxford, including John Lilly, George Buck, and George Peele. Each of the 100 sonnets is headed with a prose introduction offering a background to the verse which follows. The only word to describe the erudition of these prefaces is breathtaking. They cite and quote from 32 myths and acknowledge or quote from 25 Italian, French, and Italian sources. Commentators have puzzled over the identity of their author ever since Edward Arber in 1870 queried whether they may have been written by the Earl of Oxford. Others have suggested Chapman or Lilly. I believe the probability, excuse me, is that they are composed by Watson himself. Watson was highly educated in classical and European thought. At his old school of Winchester, the head was a leading classicist, Christopher Johnson. For me, the matter is settled by Sonnet 40 of the Hecatombathia, in which he writes about the death of Petrarch's Laura, concluding a preface by saying, under which name also the author in this sonnet specifieth her whom he lately loved. Throughout the 1580s, Watson was mixing with intellectuals excited by advancements in science, medicine, cosmography, theology, philosophy, architecture and art, literature and music. Historians have grouped these intellectuals into schools, but the groups overlapped, and I would suggest that like-minded friends don't necessarily form a school. There is a so-called School of Night. Prominent in it were the polymath and astrologer John Dee and his friend the mathematician Thomas Harriot. Harriot was employed in turn by Sir Walter Raleigh and Henry Percy, known as the Wizard Earl of Northumberland. Marlowe was associated with these men, and it would be surprising if his friend Watson did not share a place at Raleigh's dining table, or especially at Percy's, since Watson dedicated at least 2 of his works to the Earl. Present too may have been the Earl of Oxford, another of these affiliates, friend to Raleigh and believer in astrology. And Watson would have deserved a place at the table. The scientists Eric Altshuler and William Johnson have drawn attention to the preface of his Sonnet 31 in Hecatombathia, where Watson describes what he calls Galaxia, a white way, he says, a white way or milky circle in the heavens. In other words, the Milky Way. And this was advanced stuff preceding Galileo's description by some 30 years. We have a glimpse here of Watson's reputation as an intellectual with a knowledge of science and the occult, or, as was said of him, a wise man in St. Helens that could tell strange things. And this is apparent too from his book on the skill of memory training, Compendium Memoriam Localis. Now, there was another group dubbed the University Wits. The title seems to be dreamt up by the Victorian scholar George Saintsbury, who suggested a small circle of Lilly, Marlowe, Green, Peel, Lodge, Nash, and probably Kidd. But it should have included Watson. Since Sainsbury, scholars' imaginations have run riot. They've expanded the group to around 40 or so poets, playwrights, pamphleteers, and wits. Feasibly, Sainsbury's wits and Oxford's disciples are the self-same group. All except Marlowe and Kidd are known or believed to be associates of Oxford, and I think Alexander will be explaining later this, the probability is that Marlowe and Kidd were too. Music was also basking in a golden age for which Watson was perfectly suited. As a lad at Winchester School, he had been taught by Thomas Stemp, a skilled musician in charge of the cathedral choristers. Now we know that Watson had a beautiful singing voice. He recalls in his Elegy Mellibus, published in 1590, how 9 years earlier his tunes often pleased Thomas Walsingham's ear when he and Thomas Walsingham, his sweet friend, sat beside the Seine in Paris. Now, Watson was collaborating with William Byrd, one of the greatest of English composers, described even by his contemporaries as the father of British music. Byrd knew Edward de Vere, whose verses he set to music, and who signed over to him the lease for a manor in Essex. Byrd held the royal patent to printed music, and in 1589 collaborated with Watson on a vocal broadside for 6 voices entitled A Gratification unto Master John Case. The pamphlet was a novelty, poetry designed to be set to music. It was followed the following year by the historically important The First Set of Italian Madrigals Englished. Watson was actively involving himself in what was to become recognized as a glory of English music. And to quote his biographer, he was, and is, the only well-known literary man associated in any direct way with the English madrigal. Soon, Watson was moving in higher circles. At a time when every writer in London sought a commission, it is probable that Watson had received the most envied of all, a royal entertainment. In August 1591, Elizabeth commenced her most ostentatious progress for years, concluding a journey over southern England in mid-September with a 4-day entertainment at Elvertham in Hampshire, the seat of Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford. As the Queen approached the house to arrive for supper, she was met by a poet, dressed in green and wearing a laurel wreath, who fell to his knees, declaiming in Latin a panegyric to the Queen, while 6 virgins performed behind him, attired in gowns of taffeta sarcenet. It is possible that the poet who bestowed this welcome was Thomas Watson. In his paper on the entertainment, Harry H. Boyle argues that much of the poetry for the occasion was by Thomas Watson and the writer Nicholas Breton, under the direction of George Buck. Now, there is a common denominator between Watson, Breton, Buck, and Edward Seymour, at whose house the entertainment took place. All were familiar with Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Seymour and his family were friends of Oxford. Breton was probably a member of his literary circle, as of course was Watson too. As for Buck, he was not only an ally of Watson and a member of the Earl's literary circle, we know he was an intense admirer of Oxford. So perhaps we may suggest that the event could have been organised by the Earl of Oxford or by Buck in collaboration with the Earl. We have no idea what de Vere was up to between early July to early December in 1591, a period which covers the whole of the entertainment. So the possibility of his involvement cannot be ruled out. And it's worth bearing in mind too, that earlier progresses had been supervised by men in Oxford employ. George Gascoigne and Thomas Churchyard supervised the entertainment at Kenilworth in 1575, and Churchyard alone supervised the entertainment at Norwich in 1578. Watson's cooperation with the Elvertham entertainment took place against the backdrop of an increasingly complicated personal life. In December 1588, Oxford had sold Fisher's Folly to William Cornwallis. Watson stayed on as a tutor to Cornwallis's son. By now, he was married and living in the liberty of Norton Feldgate, near to the theatres and a short walk from Fisher's Folly. Towards 1592, he became increasingly trapped in a scandal involving Cornwallis's eldest daughter and a musician living in the Cornwallis home. The musician's name was Thomas Swift, and he was the brother of Watson's wife, Anne, and another brother, Hugh Swift, a lawyer, was also implicated. As the storm clouds gathered, 2 of the scandal's leading players died, it was said, of the plague. The death of Thomas Watson, Gent, was registered at St Bartholomew the Less in West Smithfield on 26th of September 1592. 10 days later, the same register entered the name of his brother-in-law, the lawyer Hewswit. Watson was just 37 years old. After his death, his friends were lavish in their tributes. His reputation was high, and his works profoundly influenced Elizabethan poetry. Watson was admired as a classicist, linguist, poet, dramatist, intellectual, and musician. He was also a government agent, a Catholic, a wit, a joker, a loyal friend, and an associate of many in high places, including the Earl of Oxford.
Ian, that was absolutely terrific. Thank you very much indeed. There's been a very lively discussions going on in the chat on the side, and nearly everybody seems to be saying that they've put in orders as you were speaking for your book, because you sound so exciting, and some of them now shivering and quailing, thinking that the books will have been entirely sold out from Amazon. But they would be absolutely right to order your book, because it's terrific, and so was your talk, which was very brilliantly explained. That was not me, by the way, muttering. I had myself on mute, so I don't know what you're talking about there. However, had I not been on mute, you're quite right, I would have muttered a bit, because I think that you were talking about the Protracticon, where Watson says, if this book is shown to Dyer and Sidney, and told that Vere has seen it, then Dyer and Sidney will bow and say, brilliant, it must be fantastic. Therefore, Vere is the senior of the poets, the judge of the poets. And you do actually get precisely the same setup that goes on in October of the Shepherd's Calendar, where Cuddy, who is Oxford, is the judge over Willie and, I can't remember his name, Perigot or something, who are Dyer and Sidney. So that little game goes on. And in fact, Gabriel Harvey brings it up and takes the side of Dyer and Sidney and saying, no, it's you who should be judging him. Anyway, we also had, by the way, in the side bit, in the chat there, an answer from Ralph Ellis. Ralph Ellis, some of you may know, is an extremely distinguished revisionist historian. And he answers the question that was put to Kevin, and rather annoying for Kevin, stumped him about the meaning of Silexidra. He says it's Mount of Flint, and suggests that flint in the 16th century was a primary source of illumination. So if Silexidra is indeed intended to be Fisher's Folly, then the connection with illumination might take us back to Vere again, who is often described as the sun, as you rightly say, as Phoebus, as the source of illumination. Now, let me introduce our first song. Thank you, Ian. We're going to have our first song, which is composed for us and sung for us by Frankie Paradiso, who is in Indonesia. And I'd just like to say that being perhaps primarily a musician more than anything else, I have noted over the many, many years how difficult, nay, impossible composers have found it to set Shakespeare sonnets. Frankie Paradiso has the most extraordinary knack of being able to do this, not only in a slightly modern idiom, but in an idiom that harks back, I think, very beautifully to the 16th and 17th centuries. And he's in this going to do the 18th sonnet, which I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. That's the one in which he says that the fair youth's eternal summer shall not fade. So let's go over to Frankie Paradiso for his setting of the 18th sonnet.
Good afternoon, fellow Oxfordians. I'm happy to be performing for you. I'll be singing a Summer's Day, a song I wrote, or a ballad I wrote 4 centuries ago as Francesco Damso Radamo, my minstrel ancestor. And it's a great honor for me to have been invited or recommended by Dr. Alexander Waugh, because my grandfather was a great admirer of his grandfather Evelyn Moore's novels and wit, which unites us all, band of brothers and sisters. shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines by chance or nature's changing course and trim. Oh, but thy eternal summer shall not fade, oh no, nor lose possession of that fair thou wist, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Oh yeah.
Well, thanks to Frankie Paradiso there. That was wonderful, Frankie. And thank you so much for sharing this with all of us. So many poems of Shakespeare work delightfully as songs. It reminds us that music was an integral part of the performance of the works in general. And we'll be hearing another song later on from the lovely Charlie Lynn. Now, it's my very great honour to introduce the man who's been the driving force behind so much of the Society's progress in the last few years. Not only has he himself been responsible for a much larger presence on social media, but he's also been ceaselessly exploring a wide range of new paths. The DVS honoured him with the badge of the Blue Boar in 2014, which he wears proudly today. He's named Oxfordian of the Year at Ashton in 2015, and we're looking forward very much to the Oxford Illusion book, which he's co-authored with Roger Stripmatter. Here today, we will find out much more about Oxford's Circle of Writers. I urge you all to listen now most carefully to our chairman, Alexander Wall.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Kevin. We are looking at the three most powerful people during the 1580s. That's Lord Burleigh, the Queen, and Sir Francis Walsingham. All of these, of course, are intimately connected to the Earl of Oxford. We know that Lord Burleigh was the Earl of Oxford's guardian and then turned out to be his father-in-law. We know that the Queen was, to some extent, his mother. I mean, he described her late in life as being, in a manner, brought up by her, in his own words. And we know from a contemporary that Sir Francis Walsingham was his assured friend. Now, Francis Walsingham and Lord Burleigh were very key members of the Privy Council, and the Privy Council did take a great interest in plays. In 1580, we know that they were pushing Oxford's men, players that is, to the University of Cambridge. In 1583, Sir Francis Walsingham set up the Queen's Majesty's Players, and in so doing took players from the Earl of Oxford's players, and these became the absolute main players for the pleasure of the Queen at court. In 1586, we hear 1584, we hear Oxford saying, "I serve Her Majesty, and I am that I am." And the question mark is, in what way was he serving her? Now, I just put some names there underneath: Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Watson, Anthony Mundy, John Lilly, and Thomas Churchyard. All of those have connections to one, two, or three of those three in the picture on the right: Burghley, Walsingham, and the Queen. And four of them have very obvious connections to the Earl of Oxford. And so what I'm going to be doing today is to be looking at Christopher Marlowe and connecting him to the Earl of Oxford, and of course, Kidd. Now we get to 1586, and something rather peculiar happens, which I think is connected to what Thomas Nash, a policy of plays, which is very necessary, which he describes as one of the secrets of government. Well, this is clearly coming from the Privy Council. Thomas Nash also talks about the importance of poets. Poets are very necessary to the state, he says in exactly the same book. They make the vulgar sort aspire to a richer purity of speech. So this policy of plays, we can glean a bit about it from Thomas Nash. What he's saying is that the government was fed up and irritated by important people such as courtiers, scholars, soldiers, lawyers, going off during the day and going to see plays that were simply rotting their brains out, and made the policy that they were going to make the plays extremely elevating not only in terms of philosophy and thought, but as Nash says, in terms of language, to get the base people all over England speaking in what we might call courtly language. Now, we have a strange thing that seems to go on in which many of you will know about in 1586, when the Exchequer, which obviously comes under the Crown and under the Queen, which pays money every year to the revels at court. This is the office that is in charge of putting on plays and shows at court. The Exchequer in 1586 suddenly drops by an average of £1,000 a year the money that it pays into the revels at court. And in exactly the same year, the Church of England, which once again falls under the Queen, she is the head of the Church of England, pays the Earl of Oxford £1,000 a year for the rest of his life. And the question is, are those two payments, the plus to Oxford and exactly the same figure going minus to the revels, are they in any way related? Certainly, if you're going to have a policy of plays, and if you're Lord Burghley and you're the Queen and you're Walsingham, you all know Oxford very well. You know that he is a stupendous scholar. You know that he is a lover of plays. Who better could you actually choose to put in charge as a patron of this policy of plays, which is going to lift up the whole spirit of England? Now, I have promised that I'm going to concentrate on the figures of Kidd, Marlowe, and Lilly. Well, of course, they come together memorably in this poem, which everyone, I think, who's listening in will know exactly what this poem is. It's to the memory of my beloved, the author William Shakespeare, from the first folio of 1626 by Ben Jonson. And I want to focus in on these lines where he's addressing Shakespeare directly. And he says, "That I not mix thee so, my brain excuses. I mean, with great but disproportioned muses. For if I thought my judgment were of years, I should commit thee surely with thy peers, and tell how far thou didst our Lilly outshine, or sporting Kidd, or Marlowe's mighty line." Now, many Oxfordians, non-Stratfordians, are exultant about this because, as we all know, Kidd, Lilly and Marlowe are not what Stratfordians call the contemporary peers of William Shakespeare. In fact, pretty well every Stratfordian scholar will admit that at least 86% of Shakespeare's plays were written after the death of Kidd and Marlowe, and that in fact that the name William Shakespeare only appears in 1593, and there's no evidence at all that Kidd, Marlowe or Lilly wrote a single play between them after 1593. Kidd, Marlowe and Lilly are categorically thought to be composers of the 1580s. So what the hell is Ben Jonson getting at here? Well, always with Ben Jonson, if you look carefully at what he's saying, he's always saying something deeper than what you think he's saying on the surface. So let's just look at these lines a little bit more carefully. The first thing is that he compares Lily, Kidd, and Marlowe. He calls them disproportioned muses. Well, what are the muses if they're not the coterie or indeed the daughters of Apollo? Apollo, the great sun god, if you like, and the disproportioned muses, the little stars around him, worshipping him. If you just look a few lines on in the same poem, Jonson says, and all the muses still were in their prime when like Apollo he came forth to warm our ears. So he's directly stating that Shakespeare is like Apollo who comes forth to warm. Well, of course, he warms because he is Phoebus Apollo. He is the sun. And here's a nice picture of him. You can see him dressed in gold in the middle of the sky. And it's very important to remember that when we talk about Phoebus Apollo, we're primarily talking about a patron. According to St. Augustine, who called Apollo him whom Athens calleth patron, or as Edmund Waller says, the grand patron of poets. Robinson in 1583 noted how, and I quote, noble writers affirm Apollo pattern chief and patron first to be. So when you're comparing someone to Apollo, certainly back in these days, you are primarily telling us that he is a patron. And that's why Lily, Marlowe and Kidd are disproportioned muses, and why here Shakespeare is said to outshine them, because he is the sun, he is their patron. Well, it's always a great embarrassment to Stratfordianists that people like Hayward say of Shakespeare that he was not worthy his patronage. Since when was Stratford Shakespeare had anything whatsoever to do with being a patron? If you look at the Droeshout portrait, it absolutely tells the same story. You look at the forehead there. Look how bright that light is in the forehead, and then those great rays coming out of his collar. What this seems clearly to be depicting is the great Phoebus Apollo, the great patron god, who is hiding behind the mask of a player. But so bright is he that the light still seems to be bursting through. Now, if we go back, 20, 30 years from Ben Jonson and look at the figure of Apollo, we find that Marlowe's very close friend, Thomas Nash, calls Edward de Vere our patron, our Phoebus. We find that Marlowe's very good friend, the playwright George Chapman, describes Edward de Vere as liberal as the sun, a clear, very obvious allusion to Apollo. And in fact, if you look at the poets and the playwrights at the time, including Thomas Watson, who was again Marlowe's great friend, you see that they are continuously associating him, comparing him to Apollo, Phoebus, because he is the great patron of the playwrights, the great patron of the poets, to whom, Green says, all scholars flock. So there's no doubt that Marlowe would have known that the great patron of the playwright was indeed Edward de Vere, the Apollo. Now, Thomas Dekker is a playwright who has his ears very much to the ground, and he writes about the children of Phoebus at the chapel of Apollo, worthy to eat at the table of the sun, some of them singing paeans to Apollo. Who is Dekker talking about? Well, he tells us, learned Watson, industrious Kidd, ingenious Atchlow, Marlowe, Green, and Peel, laughing to see Nash, that was but newly come to their college. And come back to this word college in just a moment. But given all of those contemporary writers I've just shown you who compare Edward de Vere to Apollo, he was called Apollo more than any other person in his lifetime. Given that all of those people knew that he was Apollo, I think there's a very strong reason to suppose that Dekker is alluding to Edward de Vere here as Apollo. And when he talks about this college, he is talking about those writers who gathered around so-called table of the sun, the table of Edward de Vere. So back to this idea of calling it a college. Thomas Nash was accused by Gabriel Harvey of lurking in corners, and Nash responded, "I lurk in no corners, but converse in a house of credit as well governed as any college, where there be more rare qualified men and selected good scholars than in any nobleman's house that I know in England. If I had committed such abominable villainies or were a base shifting companion, it stood not with my lord's honour to keep me." So here he is describing a place very much like a college where my lord, and elsewhere he calls him my lord of Oxford, runs some sort of college. Where is this college? Well, as I said, the playwright Green compares Oxford to Maecenas, the great patron of antiquity, and says, "Wheresoe'er Maecenas lodgeth, thither will scholars flock." One of these places where all these scholars were probably flocking is here. Looks very much like a college, a sort of Oxford or Cambridge college. It is, in point of fact, the Savoy Hospital, bordered on the south by the Thames and on the north by the Strand, right opposite Lord Burleigh's house, Cecil House. And Burleigh was a trustee of this building. We know that Oxford had several lodgings and tenements in it as early as 1573. We know that John Lilly, who was his secretary and was a playwright, was also in that so-called college, and many believe that Gabriel Harvey was there early on. Gabriel Harvey says, "I first came to know Lilly at the Savoy," and was given money by the Earl of Oxford. So he possibly was part of this group. We don't know any other names that were at the Savoy. But it's interesting that Gabriel Harvey then got irritated with Lilly and with the people at Savoy, got irritated with the what he conceived to be rather affected language that the Earl of Oxford was promoting. We sometimes give it the name euphuism, which means a style of high alliteration, similes, things like that, very much pioneered by Oxford's secretary, John Lilly. And Gabriel Harvey, as late as November 1589, writes, "I cannot stand the euphuing of similes a la Savoyica." That's very much implying that there's quite a gang of writers in the Savoy at that time who were writing in this affected, what he considered to be a very affected manner. Of course, Oxford was teaching them to speak courtly. We know that Thomas Nash describes Oxford, "the first in our language I have encountered that repurified poetry from art's pedantism and that instructed it to speak courtly. Our patron, our Phoebus, our first Orpheus or quintessence of invention he is." This idea of speaking courtly, it has a resonance in a quotation that all of you, I suspect, will be familiar with in 1589 from the Art of English Poesy. And he says, "And in Her Majesty's time that now is, are sprung up another crew of courtly makers, noblemen and gentlemen of Her Majesty's own servants, who have written excellently well, as it would appear, if their doings could be found out and made public with the rest, of which number is first that noble gentleman, Edward, Earl of Oxford." There's a little hint, I think, in here that the crew he's talking about, who first is Edward, Earl of Oxford, is suggesting, I think, Edward, Earl of Oxford as the leader of this crew, of this group, who are writing so well, but whose names can't necessarily be spoken. Perhaps they're part of this secret policy of plays that Nash talks about. But Harvey seems to think that Oxford is definitely the leader of it. He calls him the godfather of writers, the superintendent of the press, the master of innumerable bands, the general of the field. Now, the Savoy didn't last forever. Kevin, in his very interesting talk, touched upon Fisher's Folly. We don't know when the Savoy came to an end, and there very well may have been an interregnum when the college was moved to Fisher's Folly. It certainly was large enough, and we know that Marlowe and his great friend Thomas Watson were arrested in Hog Lane, that I've just outlined there, for killing a man in an altercation over a debt of £14 that was owed to the Pie Inn. And the Pie Inn and Hog Lane are either side of Fisher's Folly. which is where the Earl of Oxford lived. And it looks very much to me as though Marlowe and Watson were up there because they were having dealings with the Earl of Oxford, and once again were part of this college. It's interesting that the lawyer who supported Watson was, as has been mentioned, Hugh Swift, and Hugh Swift is known to have dined at the table of the Earl of Oxford. Now, what we do know for certain is after that possible interregnum at Fisher's Folly, Oxford set up his literary college in this street called St. Peter's Hill, in a house on the east side. Stowe describes it as, on the east side of this lane standeth a large house or ancient building, I've got my thing blocking, sometime belonging to the Abbot of St. Mary in York, and was his abiding house when he came to London. Thomas Randolph, Esquire, hath lately augmented and repaired it. This enormous house belonged to Thomas Randolph, who was the brother-in-law of Watson and Marlowe's great protector and friend, Thomas Walsingham. And Randolph describes Francis Walsingham as uncle. He calls him uncle. So this big house connects us not only to Walsingham once again, also to Burghley, because the part which Oxford was renting, it was being sublet to him from the mother of Burghley's secretary, who's called Michael Hicks. So we have Burghley, Walsingham, and indeed, in fact, later on, we get the Revels. George Buck, who's been mentioned this evening, put Revels' office into this enormous house. Now, this house and the history of this house and what happened in this house, I think, has been utterly underrated by historians of Shakespeare, historians of theatre, and historians of the Earl of Oxford, because it ended in a total catastrophe. Oxford said to his servant, the poet and the playwright, Thomas Churchyard, go and rent this enormous house, take men into it. We can be absolutely sure that there was Churchyard and at least 3 other students. We don't know all of them. And the rent was very high. It was £100 a year. And Oxford, because he had run out of money, failed to pay the first quarter's rent. And Churchyard got into terrible trouble over it because he had made a promise to Churchyard and had essentially made a breach of that promise. So Churchyard had to run into a church, funnily enough, and seek sanctuary against the law because he was being pursued for this money. Well, Oxford somehow had to get out of it. Churchyard went to the Queen and grumbled about and blubbed about it, which I think made Churchyard and Oxford put them right out with each other. Nash, I believe, took Churchyard's side. And Nash, of course, was definitely one of the ones that was in this house. We kind of know that from reading something called Piers Penniless, which is what Nash wrote. Thank you. Piers Penniless is a book that Nash wrote just after being chucked out. And it starts, it's a fascinating little book, and it starts, oh, woe is me, I can't find a patron anywhere, I'm stony broke. And he says, I am quite undone through promise breach. One drone should not have driven so many bees from their honeycombs. He's already in this passage described patrons as drones, and he's undone by promise breach. There's plenty more if you read around Nash to show that he was certainly in the house with Thomas Churchyard that came to this crashing end in 1591. Now, I'm going to go back to push this point about Marlowe and Kidd being part of that, and we're going to look at a letter that Thomas Kidd wrote in 1593 to Sir John Puckering, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal. Kidd had been arrested and was in big trouble, arrested on suspicion of sedition. And he wrote to Peel, pleading with him to intercede with his lord and say that he's innocent. Now, we don't know who this lord is. He doesn't name him, but he's my lord whom I have served for almost 6 years. And when we look carefully at this letter, we can pull out certain things about it that give us big clues about who he's talking about. We know, for instance, that this lord was not a member of the Privy Council. And we know that because he's being asked, Kidd is asking Puckering to intercede on his behalf to this lord, asking the Privy Council to intercede. So clearly the lord is someone who's got connections with the Privy Council, but he is not on the Privy Council. We know that Marlowe presented himself to this lord sometime after autumn 1587. That's when Kidd starts working, and we know that Marlowe comes after Kidd. We know from this letter that Marlowe and Kidd ceased writing plays together under one roof for this Lord's Players in 1591, and then that's the same year as this catastrophe happens regarding the place in St. Peter's Hill. And we know that this lord, who had prayers read in his house every day, and I quote, could not endure the name or sight of Marlowe after he had learnt of his atheism. So we know that this lord is quite pious. Now, if you go to the traditional scholars, they'll say, oh yes, this lord has to be one of three people. It has to be either Lord Pembroke, Lord Strange, or Lord Sussex. The reason they think it has to be one of those three is because after 1591, 1592, 3, 4, later than that, we start getting plays saying that they're performed by Marlowe, saying they're performed by Pembroke's men or by Strange's men or Sussex's men. We know also that Marlowe was arrested at the beginning of 1592 and said, oh, don't treat me bad because I know Lord Strange. And so that has made people put 2 and 2 together and get 5 and say one of these three must be the lord who is referenced here. But in fact, I think they're very much offbeat. For starters, Lord Pembroke didn't even have any players until 1592, so you can rule him out straight away. Strange, neither Pembroke nor Strange nor Sussex's men ever put on any serious plays at court after 1583, when the Queen's Majesty's Men was set up. And none of them is particularly known to be pious. But of course, the most telling sentence in Kidd's letter that everybody seems to ignore is point 4. This lord, who had prayers read in his house every day, could not endure the name or sight of Marlowe. Well, if he couldn't endure the name and sight of Marlowe, how likely is it that you would have the Right Honourable Earl of Pembroke, his servants, playing a play by Christopher Marlowe written in public? He couldn't endure his name. I can't see any way that you can get around that these Pembroke, Strange and the others did not, if they were the lord who's being referred to in this letter, they couldn't possibly have stood his name. So I think it really all now starts pointing to our great friend, the Earl of Oxford, who fits like a glove to every single part of this. He was not a member of the Privy Council, but as I've shown you at the very beginning, he's very closely connected to it. So it's actually the right thing that Kidd should ask the Privy Council to intercede on behalf of Oxford. Marlowe presented himself to this lord sometime after autumn 1587. Is it likely that the poor scholar Christopher Marlowe would present himself to the Earl of Oxford? As I've already said, many of Marlowe's friends, including Chapman and Nash, describe him as the great patron of the playwright. So yes, a poor scholar might present himself. In fact, Thomas Nash actually says of Oxford, all poor scholars acknowledge him as their patron, provider and supporter, for there cannot be a threadbare cloak sooner peep forth, but he straight presses it to be an outbrother of his bounty. So absolutely Marlowe would present himself as a poor scholar to the Earl of Oxford. And then, of course, this idea that it was so irritated by Marlowe for his atheism, and he had prayers in his house every day. We have many, many contemporaries talking about the Earl of Oxford, describing his special piety, that he was holy and religious, devout and magnificent, a religious nobleman, etc., etc. So yes, I think he is the primary person to be looking at. And there's more to this. What was Oxford doing with all these playwrights? What was the end game of it? If we look at the biggest, most scholarly work ever written on the Elizabethan stage, that's E.K. Chambers' Elizabethan stage of 1923, we notice a sentence that is very rarely commented upon by scholars. Hunnis, Lilly and Evans were all working together under the Earl's patronage. He's talking about the Earl of Oxford. This is a very important and very telling sentence. John Lilly, Hunnis and Henry Evans were effectively in control between them of Oxford's men, Oxford's boys, the Queen's Majesty's players, Paul's boys, and the children of the chapel. These were all the favourite players of the Queen, the favourite players of court. And Lilly, of course, was pretty well in charge of mounting the masks and plays at court, as well as the entertainments. The entertainment's something that Ian touched upon. And of course, John Lilly was not only the secretary of the Earl of Oxford, but he's also working very closely with the Office of Revels and Tents and Toils. Now, if Oxford is in command of this whole gang of extremely important court players, they're obviously a hungry mob and they need material to act. So we're going to take just a closer look. Oh, I'm just going to point this out very quickly first. I've been fooled by my own presentation. Will Hunnis, many of you will know this actually, Will Hunnis got the lease of the Blackfriars Theatre from his underling Farrant, sold it all in the space of 1 year to Henry Evans, who sold it to the Earl of Oxford, who gave it to John Lilly. This all happened in 1 year, and that alone, but there's more evidence that Chambers shows, that alone tells us that these four were acting as a gang, as one. I want to look closely, if I may, at what I consider this extraordinary network of Oxford and his band of brothers. Now, it is an uncontested fact that John Lilly and Anthony Mundy were secretary servants of the Earl of Oxford, and they were servants at the same time. To me, this is absolutely extraordinary, and it beggars belief why that fact alone has not been investigated, written about, and the basic question, why? Why should it be that this scholar, patron, play-loving Earl should be hiring at the same time 2 playwright actors as his secretaries? But that is actually just the tip of the iceberg, because we know also that Thomas Churchyard was employed at various times by the Earl of Oxford. As we've said, he was put in charge of entertainments, and there's something interesting about Churchyard. As I said, Churchyard fell out with Oxford in 1591 over that quarrel of when the whole thing fell to pieces. And Churchyard said that he was going to dedicate the great anthology of all his works to the Earl of Oxford, but he didn't do it. He went off the Earl of Oxford. We all know why. But what's extraordinary is in that work, he gives a bibliography of all of his pieces. And among them, he describes, I quote, "works gotten from me of some such noble friends as I am loath to offend, including an infinite number of songs and sonnets given where they cannot be recovered, nor purchase any favour where they are craved." This begs the question to me whether Churchyard wasn't writing little bits and bobs of Shakespeare plays where he now can't get them back and he can't put them in his bibliography. We have Robert Greene, who dedicates work to the Earl of Oxford, and is described by Harvey as such a secretary of Oxford. And of course, he wrote plays like Selimus and Friar Bacon, which were played by the Queen's Majesty's Players. We have Thomas Nash, who, as I've said, was part of that college when it collapsed in 1591. And he gets very cross with Oxford and dedicates mischievously and very funnily, I think, anonymously to him, Strange News in 1592. Thomas Watson, well, we've talked about him and his connection to the Earl of Oxford through Hecatompathia. It's worth pointing out that Nash and Watson were very good friends. In fact, I think Nash calls him dearly loved and honoured. We have Thomas Lodge, and as I think was just said in that brilliant talk by Ian, Thomas Watson's sister lived with Thomas Lodge, a sort of quasi brother. Watson, we know, was a very close friend of John Lilly, and Lilly was at Oxford with Lodge. Lodge and Greene wrote a play together called Looking Glass for London, which was performed by the Queen's Majesty's Players. It's also worth pointing out that Thomas Lodge, Robert Greene, and John Lilly, between them, wrote 6 books with the name Euphues in the title. They form the sort of core, if you like, of the Euphuists, very, very much associated the literary group around the Earl of Oxford. Robert Greene wrote a comedy with Thomas Nash, who is described almost as his brother by Harvey. So they're very thick together, and they're definitely working at the same time. They're also working on what is called the Marprelate controversy, another thing that I believe was sponsored by Oxford. Nash, well, we've talked about his relationship with Churchyard. They did have a great quarrel after the 1591 bust-up, but then he says he's a great friend of his, and they all make up later, although Harvey tries to stir it. Thomas Nash wrote a play with Christopher Marlowe about Dido, and this play, we know, was performed by the children of the chapel. That puts him indirectly under the patronage straight away of the Earl of Oxford, but also don't forget that he is put at the table of the son, Christopher Marlowe, with Nash by Dekker in that example I've just shown you. So we've got two reasons already putting him there together. Marlowe and Watson, well, we just said they were great friends, arrested together, and Marlowe and Kidd were sharing a room together. Kidd was at school with Thomas Lodge. Now, before I take this screen any further, this is my last, might be pleased to hear, this is my last exhibit. But before I go any further, I just want to point out that all of these 9 playwrights are said by Stratfordian scholars and many, many scholars to be influences on Shakespeare. But of course, the great tragedy for the Stratfordians is not a single one of these playwrights seems ever to have met William Shakespeare. And as you can already see, they're already connecting very, very nicely to the Earl of Oxford. Now, that brings us to the group that Ian mentioned all around the Hecatompathia. This is the book of Thomas Watson. All of these ones I've shown in yellow here, they were all playwrights, they were all friends, most of them were at Oxford. They all contribute to a book that seems to be sponsored and is dedicated to the Earl of Oxford. If we go back to our great friend Dekker and what he said, he says that, well, he groups Thomas Watson with Thomas Kidd and Thomas Atchellow, and he says these 3 were very great friends, and they all wrote for the actor John Bentley. John Bentley was the chief actor of the Queen's Majesty's players. So once again, we're getting indirect lines from Kidd to Atchellow and again Watson to the Earl of Oxford. Marlowe, we know from Kidd, was a great friend of Matthew Royden. Now, what's happened to Matthew Royden's comedies? Again, we don't know. They've all disappeared, but he received the highest praise in his time. Was he sitting around the table? Was he contributing little bits to Shakespeare plays? Certainly he connects to the Earl of Oxford through the Hecatompathia. And then George Peele, well, we've already seen how he connects to Oxford through the Hecatompathia. He also wrote the Arraignment of Paris, of course, that was played by the Queen's Majesty's Men. And as I showed you earlier on, he's part of that group around the Table of the Sun that Dekker talks about. So again, we've got indirect lines from Peele to the Earl of Oxford. Now, I'm actually going to draw this talk to a close here, but there is a whole nother chapter which I think is completely fascinating. And what I'm going to try to do is maybe get that up online in a different place. And basically, just to tell you what that chapter is I'm just describing a complete catastrophe in 1591 that brings the whole end to Oxford's scriptorium. And it sends people like Marlowe, Green, Nash, they're all out on their limbs looking desperately for new patrons. They're all totally out of money, Lily as well. The Queen's Men completely disappears into the countryside. The players of St. Paul's, they go. And of course, Oxford, as we know, disappears more or less from the court scene after 1591. And in 1593, the name Shakespeare comes up. But all of that, I think, is for another time, another chapter. Let's call this chapter 1. And I hope that in the evidence I've laid before you, we can see at very least that the most likely patron for Marlowe Kidd was that which Ben Jonson linked with Lily, who we know was an Oxford servant, and that is to say they were under the patronage of the Earl of Oxford. I have no idea whether I took a very long time or a short time, but if there is time for questions, I'm very happy to take them. Thank you.
Alexander, thank you very much for your usual tour de force. Very remarkable connections you're making. Obviously, the questions we can come up with will only touch the surface. The first one is a question from Cheryl Egan Donovan, which is about whether there are actually manuscript correspondence between any of these writers and Edward de Vere as such?
The manuscript trail is very poor indeed. There's a little scrap that is said to be in Marlowe's hand, but as we know, there's no place in Vere's hand. There's no place in any of these. There is a manuscript of Green's, and that's quite interesting, which is in the Dulwich Library, and why that's interesting is because we talk about this terrible bust-up in 1591 when everything went wrong. Green is teased by Nash, I believe it is, or maybe Harvey, for having sold his play to the Queen's Majesty's men and then sold it again to Allen's players. Again, what seems to be happening there is this complete sinking of the ship, the scuttling of all these different people. I don't suppose they were very rich, but they were earning their bread and their keep, and their, in Oxford's college, they're suddenly all cast out. That's brought to mind because of the Orlando Furioso manuscript that's in Dulwich, which is a very, very fascinating manuscript for other reasons too. And again, I think someone should go down and have a look at it. We should have a whole talk on that separately. But no, there isn't much by way of manuscripts, I'm afraid. I would just say that it's a slightly weird and fantastical theory, but I don't wonder if Marlowe exists as a separate entity, a separate name from the great Shakespeare school, although all these experts are now telling us that his hand is all over some of the Shakespeare plays, Henry VI particularly, but he exists as a separate entity, possibly because Edward de Vere couldn't stand the sight of him after he realized his atheism, and that therefore his contribution to the Shakespeare canon, which may have included Edward II and things like that, they were sort of let loose and they got a life of their own, and hence Marlowe has this great name for himself. Just an idea, it's a guess.
I'm afraid that we're actually running behind, but I think we have to draw it to a halt. And I apologize to very significant people, Roger Strittmatter, Richard Wargaman, Ron Roffel, and Robert Schwab, whose questions, unfortunately, we can't pursue. Perhaps you would like to ask them and put them on the DVS forum about this.
Thank you, Heward, and I will certainly look into the DVS forum and catch up on any questions that have been left there. Honour time, glory time, happy time, breath of fresh air time. Our much beloved patron, Derek Jacobi, who's done so much and put his neck on the line so much for the cause of Oxfordianism. And let us not forget that he trained in his early years as a historian. He's not only one of the finest actors of Shakespeare ever, but he's one of the finest minds ever. And we're so honoured and so happy to have him here. And he's going to read for us Sonnet 33. And of course, to Oxfordians, that has a great resonance. Doesn't mean anything to Stratfordians, but to Oxfordians often see this little pun going on about the sun and are reminded of the son of Edward de Vere, who died, we think was born at Headingham, and Edward de Vere went up and literally probably died in his arms an hour later. But I think there are resonances of that in this sonnet. And thank you very much. Derek, over to you.
Full many a glorious morning have I seen, flatter the mountain tops with sovereign eye, kissing with golden face the meadows green, gilding pale streams with heavenly alchemy. Anon, permit the basest clouds to ride with ugly wrack on his celestial face, and from the forlorn world his visage hide, stealing unseen to west with this disgrace. Even so my sun one early morn did shine, with all triumphant splendor on my brow. But out alack, he was but 1 hour mine. The region cloud hath masked him from me now. Yet him for this my love no whit disdaineth. Sons of the world may stain when heaven's sun staineth.
Very, very beautiful. Thank you. As I said, we can't applaud on this ridiculous machine, but we can write things like bravo that are coming up in the sidelines. Thank you, Derek, very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Now, since the main task of the DVS is to unmask, we thought we might play a little bit of fun and do a bit of unmasking tonight ourselves by including a mystery guest. He is a writer, actor, director, teacher, coach, a great expert on Shakespeare, and of course, a committed Oxfordian, and someone who is utterly beloved of all those who come under his spell, his delightful and instructive influence. I saw a performance he directed and performed in of As You Like It in the shade of the great keep at Headingham Castle, and I have to say it was one of the most enjoyable Shakespeare comedies I have ever watched. He is, of course, Ron Destro.
Is she to be buried in Christian burial that willfully seeks her own salvation? How could that be? Unless she drowned herself in her own defense. It must be, se offendendo. Cannot be else. For here lies the point. If I drown myself wittingly, it argues an act. And an act has three branches. It is to act, to do, to perform. Our gal, she drowned herself wittingly. I'll explain that in a minute. Thank you very much. I want to let you know I'm very honored to have been invited here and to follow the great Alexander Waugh and the wonderful Sir Derek Jacobi. As an Oxfordian actor and director, there's a telling story that I should mention. In 2008, I was about to begin what turned out to be 10 years of private study with John Barton. And I was with Sir Derek the day before. We were doing a master class in London. And he knew I was going to see John the next morning. So he said, whatever you do, don't tell John that you are an Oxfordian. I said, oh, no, I don't tell anybody that. You know, in those days, we all, except for Sir Derek, we were in the closet about letting people know that, because we could be and still are ostracized for being Oxfordian. So the next day, I went to meet with John, and the first thing he said, because I had created the Oxford Shakespeare Company, and he said, well, Oxford, what is the Oxford in the Oxford Shakespeare Company? And I said, well, Derek Jacobi told me not to tell you, but I'm an Oxfordian. And he said, oh, it doesn't matter. It's all right. So, but John was rare in that. I have been ostracized among Shakespeare professionals. So a group of anti-Oxfordians tried to stop our performance of Henry V on the battlefield of Agincourt a few years ago. But we mushed on once more onto the breach when we did perform. But the question that always comes up is, does knowing who the author is affect the actor? And I've talked to Sir Derek about it. I've talked to Michael York about it, and Jeremy Irons. And the consensus seems to be, no, it doesn't really affect it in terms of the fact that we are actors who are playing a character, pursuing objectives within a certain context of the play. So while we're doing it, we're not thinking of who the author is, and we're thinking of what the character wants. But when I did The Gravedigger recently in Elsinore, my concern when I was performing was to get that grave dug. However, knowing who the author was helped to clarify things for me. Why is The Gravedigger echoing the Hales v. Pettit legal case? Well, an actor always has to ask why. What is I need to know what my role is, my function in the play. And I look up the case as an actor. Any actor can look it up and say, if you have an Arden and it has the notes in it, and you say, oh, okay, it has to do with this Hales versus Pettit case. But then you still say, well, why? What relevance does that have to me bringing this up as a gravedigger? And so, why is Hamlet obsessed with his lost inheritance, as the great Tom Renier wrote about? Why he seems to be more obsessed with that than with ruling Denmark, which is not in the play, this idea of the crown, as much as his inheritance, what he's lost. So at any rate, there's nothing in the play to help us. But if we know how the play is related to Oxford's lost inheritance, then it clarifies and it helps us as an actor. If you take All's Well That Ends Well, it's a problem play because the ending, Bertram accepts Helen at the end. If she, my liege, can make me know this clearly, I'll love her dearly, ever, ever dearly. Well, it's confusing for an actor to say, well, he obviously doesn't love her. Why the sudden switch at the end? And it becomes problematic. But knowing about De Vere and all the autobiographical elements of the play, the youth who's made ward of the crown, the escape to Italy, an elevated title, a forced marriage, a reluctant groom, a bed trick, knowing how things did not work out for Edward and Anne, then it suddenly is all clarified for the actor and for the director. Every time I direct the play, I have Bertram saying, yes, I will love her ever, ever dearly. And he sort of motions for Helena to go off, follow the king and the entourage. And as soon as they're off, he doesn't follow her, he follows Diana, who goes off the other way. And that helps to clarify for the audience that this is an ironic ending, which I think it is, based on what I've discovered about the author. So knowing who the playwright is clarifies, and it solves the problems. You have difficult passages, you have apparent dichotomies, strange motivations, and that is all helped by knowing who the author is. Why are Oberon and Titania fighting over a changeling boy? They could be arguing about anything. But where does this boy come from? And it kind of echoes what's in the sonnets. And so, out alack, he was but 1 hour mine. And Alexander points to the loss of Lord Bulbeck. And if you subscribe to the PT theory, then there's another loss of a son. So it's all helpful, useful information. Every character is the author's voice, I think, no matter what. He or she reveals himself or herself in every character. I think every writer does this. So if you think the Stratford man wrote the plays, you have the wrong perspective. And as an actor, you may be elevating the commoner more than was intended, or you may be denigrating noblemen or the king more than is appropriate. I think you won't get the parody if you have the wrong author, and that's why it's important. An actor can discover the inside joke if you're playing Malvolio and you read The Fortunate Unhappy. And then you can look it up and find out, well, that was Christopher Hatton's Nom de Plume. But again, why is the Stratford man skewering Sir Christopher Hatton? Doesn't make any sense. But if you understand who the author is, suddenly it's possible for him to be lampooning Hatton and Burleigh and Leicester and not having his head chopped off. And there are ulterior motives for it. So, and the last thing is it adds resonance to know who wrote this. It makes it personal. The Oxford Shakespeare Company, we do these overseas workshops in Europe and England, and we do the plays in their original location. So we did Hamlet behind Castle Elsinore. We did The Merchant of Venice in Villa Foscari. We did Richard II at Flint Castle, Wales, where the historic Richard gave up his crown. We've done Henry V on the battlefield of Agincourt, where there are still thousands of bodies buried in unknown trenches in the earth below. We did Richard III on Bosworth Field, where he was killed. In Macbeth, we often do in front of Burnham Oak, which is a tree that stood there during the true reign of Macbeth. So when we do that, something magical happens when we know we're playing real people, real events, slightly modified, of course, but this really happened to real people on this same ground. And there's something very magical about reenacting this material where it happened. And it becomes more than a play. It's bigger than a play. Added to that, the events of the author's own life, and then it's very, very significant. And it gives you, as an actor, it gives you more confidence, I think, to go out and do what you're doing. There's an added depth. It's like, people always say, it's like knowing that Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible as a response to the 1950s political witch hunts, or Oedipus at Colonus perhaps mirrored, some people say, Sophocles' relationship with his daughter and his sons. And so there's an added poignance to it. Greatest voice in rock and roll, Steve Perry from Journey. Steve recently came out with an album after 22 years of doing nothing, no music at all. And an album called Traces. And he writes, it's a song. If you're a singer and you find the song and you read these lyrics, I never knew, I never tried to feel the pain you've held inside. Now you're gone, it's too late to reach for you. And though we're miles apart, you belong to me. Well, it may sound like, well, they've split up and she moved to California, whatever, and they're miles apart. But if you know the true story, that it's about a woman that he fell in love with and died, it becomes more meaningful. Glenn Campbell's I'm Not Gonna Miss You, where he says, you're the last person I will love, you're the last face I will recall, and best of all, I'm not gonna miss you. How do you interpret that? Well, if you know that he wrote that after he discovered he had Alzheimer's, it has a different poignancy. So anyway, I'm very happy to share that with you and give you the perspective of the actor and the director. And it's very useful for me, but whenever I start a workshop with actors, I always say, I tell them what I think in the play comes from Oxford's real life. And then I say, look, this is not a cult. You don't have to join it. That's okay. You don't have to believe it. But I think it's helpful to know this. And many, many young actors now are coming around and saying, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So that's what I wanted to tell you. And if apparently people are afraid that Ian's book is going to run out. There's still plenty of copies of my book around, just so you know that. Shameless plug. Anyway, now that I'm finished, and we near the end of our presentations, we have the wonderful actress and musician, Charlie Lim. And she has the world premiere of her own composition of The Wind and the Rain from Twelfth Night.
I was a little tiny boy with a hey-ho, the wind and the rain. A foolish thing was but a toy, for the rain, it raineth every day. But when I came to man's estate with a hey-ho, the wind and the rain, against knaves and thieves men shut their gates, for the rain, it raineth every day. But when I came alas to wife with a hey-ho, the wind and the rain, by swaggering could I never thrive, for the rain, it raineth every day. When I came unto my beds with a hey-ho, the wind and the rain, with tosspots still had drunken heads, words for the rain it raineth every day. A great while ago the world begun with a hey-ho, the wind and the rain. But that's all one, our play is done, and we'll strive to please you every day. A great while ago the world begun.
Thank you. That's very beautiful indeed, and how kind of you to sing it for us and to compose it for us. We couldn't be more honoured. We now have come to the end of our proceedings, but before you all leave, I did promise some Christmas presents were going to be drawn out of a hat, which I have before me here, and in little names. I just won't look, and out they come. The first prize, well, according to prize, the first present is a copy of Renaissance Man, the book that everybody's craving, and we can tell that it's run out from Amazon. So luckily I've got a signed copy from the author here, which I'll put in the post tomorrow too. There's another prize here, which is a witty play, a 2 CD set, a radio play called Shakespeare in Court, that puts a Stratfordianist on the dock against a very vicious and high-powered attorney prosecuting. And that is going to be sent tomorrow to... 2 more to go. We've got 4 in all. This, I think, is rather lovely. I don't know if you can see it. When I was researching the piece for you, I found this. It's a 1750s engraving of the Savoy. And you can have great fun. Whoever wins it can have great fun staring at the windows and wondering behind which Shakespeare, De Vere and his crew were writing all those plays. Well, I'm very happy to donate that to the fund, and that is going to go to, finally, the last draw. Now, this is really nice. I don't know how well you can see it, but it's a gilded coat of arms of the Earl of Oxford, and it's done. It's a unique technique, and it's done by Maudie Lowe, and she has a gallery called Louise Lowe in Clevedon, and she developed this technique of doing things with gilding, and I think it's utterly beautiful, and she's got lots of work. You can see it on her website. Anyway, she's very kindly donated this to the Society, and it's going to be sent tomorrow to... Now, that leaves me only, of course, to do the thanking, which is so genuine and heartfelt, because there's been a lot of effort gone into this. And obviously the people who have appeared on screen, a massive thank you to Charles, Kevin, Annabelle and Richard, Derek, Charlie, Frankie, Ron, Eddie, Ian, Heward and Rosemary. We mustn't forget the incredible support that we've had from people who have not appeared on the screen tonight, particularly our heroic and invisible ringmaster, Costa Chard, our goddess of gilding, Maudie Lowe, who did that picture I've just shown you, and our goddess of organisation, Yvonne Cheel, and our technical whiz, Paul Middleton, and our honorary secretary, Amanda Hines, and the formidable wizard, Ralph Walker-Smith. I don't know if you know who he is, but the whole design of tonight's thing was done by him. If you've looked at our website, that's all done by him. The whole relook, the rebranding of the De Vere Society, which I think has been so successful, has been done by Ralph Walker-Smith. So we're very grateful to him. I hope I haven't forgotten anyone. If I have, I thank you too. I would just like to say that if you like the work we do, you like what we get up to, please visit our website if you could help us in any ways, or indeed, if you can, I'd like to join the Society, you would be most welcome. Now, in her sweetness, Charlie Lim has kindly agreed to play us out, so there remains nothing further for me to say, but our revels now are ended, and these our actors are as spirits melted into air. Thank you and good night.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously. I have loved you so long, delighting in your company. Oh, green sleeves was was my heart of gold, and who but my lady